The heavy steel claw of the excavator hung motionless over the roof of the bookstore. A jagged shadow stretching across the street like a predator's limb. Inside, the crystal chandelier didn't just sway. It shrieked, its glass prisms colliding in a frantic, irregular rhythm as the floorboards groaned under a vibration that felt less like construction and more like an assault. Margaret pressed her palms against the front window, her breath fogging the glass, just as a hairline fracture raced across the pane with the sound of a pistol shot. On the floor, amidst a heap of fallen, centuries-old books, lay a single blue folder that shouldn't have been there. As the first brick of the neighboring house crumbled into dust, Margaret's eyes locked onto a signature at the bottom of a document. A familiar, sweeping flourish that turned the blood in her veins to ice. Outside, the town was laughing, hanging festive garlands for the festival. While a few feet away, a man she had known her entire life stood behind a curtained window, watching the machines move in to bury her alive. The bell above the door chimed with a familiar, silver-tongued resonance, a sound that usually signaled the start of a quiet afternoon. Margaret Hensley stood on the upper rungs of the wooden stramanca, her fingers dusted with the fine, pale powder of aged paper and the lingering scent of cinnamon tea. With a focused gentleness, she reached for the thick, evergreen garlands draped across the high shelves. Each movement was deliberate, ensuring the tiny gold bells nestled within the needles didn't tangle. Outside, the streets of Asheville were already transforming for the Founders' Festival, a riot of red ribbons and cedar boughs. But here, inside pages of the past, the world felt suspended in amber. She adjusted a delicate paper snowflake in the front window, watching how the winter sun cast lacy, geometric shadows across the spines of leather-bound classics. A sense of profound safety enveloped her. The fireplace at the back of the shop crackled softly, a rhythmic companion to the ticking of the grandfather clock. To Margaret, these books were more than inventory. They were a collective breath, a library of souls she had been tasked to protect. She smiled as a draft of cold, mountain air swept in with a customer, the brass bell jingling a melodic welcome that seemed to harmonize with the festive spirit of the town. The tranquility shattered with the arrival of the afternoon mail. The postman, his face flushed from the biting wind, didn't offer his usual pleasantry about the weather. Instead, he handed her a thick envelope, its weight disproportionate to its size, marked with a stark red stamp that screamed urgent. Margaret stepped down from the ladder, the wood groaning under her weight. Her thumb caught on the seal, tearing it with a jagged, frantic sound. As she pulled the document free, the dry legal jargon began to blur before her eyes. Eminent domain, forced buyout, urban renovation. The word eviction stood out, a black ink stain on her heart. The paper rattled in her hands, the sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. The city demanded she vacate immediately. The festive warmth of the shop vanished, replaced by a cold, clinical dread that made the very air feel thin and unbreathable. A sudden, low-frequency throb began to vibrate through the floorboards, rattling the teacup she'd left on the counter. Margaret pressed her palms against the window glass, feeling the hum in her teeth. Outside, the idyllic festival preparations were being cut through by a monstrous yellow shape. A heavy excavator, looking like a prehistoric beast made of steel and grease, lurched toward the historic Miller house next door. With a sickening crunch, the metal claw slammed into the century-old brickwork. Dust erupted in a gray plume, obscuring the festive flags. Each impact of the machine felt like a physical blow to Margaret's chest. The vibrations traveled through the shared foundation, causing the crystal chandelier above her head to sway. Its delicate glass prisms chimed a frantic, irregular warning, a frantic tintinnabulation that signaled the end of her sanctuary. The world seemed to lurch violently to the left. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the shop. The sound of the main display window yielding to the pressure. A jagged fissure, like a lightning bolt frozen in glass, raced across the pane. Margaret threw her arms up to shield her face as slivers of glass rained down like frozen tears. From the top shelves, books began to fall. They hit the floor with heavy, wet thuds, their spines snapping, their pages fluttering like the wings of dying birds. She watched in horror as a first edition of Shakespeare, a treasure James had found in a dusty attic years ago, tumbled into a pile of debris. The leather binding split, exposing the fragile, yellowed interior to the grime of the floor. The scent of lavender and old paper was instantly overwhelmed by the metallic tang of pulverized stone and the aching smell of diesel. Driven by a desperate maternal instinct, Margaret dropped to her knees. She began scooping up the fallen volumes, her fingers catching on shards of glass, but she hardly felt the stings. She scrambled toward the small back office, her boots sliding on the slick, dust-covered floor. In her haste, she collided with a massive cardboard box that had sat undisturbed in the corner for nearly a decade. It tipped over, disgorging a chaotic waterfall of old receipts, newspaper clippings, and faded folders. Margaret slumped against the wall, chest heaving, clutching a tattered copy of Great Expectations to her heart. Amidst the sea of gray and yellowed paper, a flash of bright blue caught her eye. It was a folder, pristine and unweathered, as if it had been placed there recently by a ghost. She pulled the folder from the heap. There was no label, no identifying mark, but the contents were a map of a betrayal she hadn't yet imagined. Inside were detailed blueprints for the new Asheville project. Where her shop stood, there was a planned entrance for an elite parking garage. Her eyes scanned the engineering reports, her breath hitching as she read the words, structurally unsound and condemned. The signatures on the inspections were dated for weeks she knew no inspector had visited. It was a fabricated death sentence, a paper trail of bribes and backroom deals disguised as progress. The scale of the conspiracy made her head spin. It wasn't just a renovation. It was an assassination of the town's soul. At the very bottom of the final page, a signature stopped her heart. It was a bold, sweeping flourish she would have known anywhere. Robert Gates. Her mind flashed back to a summer 30 years ago, the two of them sitting on these very floorboards, Robert helping her sort through a shipment of poetry. He had been the boy who shared his sandwiches with her, the man who had spoken at James's funeral. Now, he was the mayor who had signed the order to bulldoze her life. A cold, crystalline fury began to replace the fear. The document trembled in her hand, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of the rage radiating through her limbs. Her oldest friend had traded their history for a political legacy of concrete and glass. She didn't wait to put on a coat. Margaret marched through the swirling snow toward the town hall, the blue folder tucked firmly under her arm like a shield. The lobby was a cavern of cold marble and echoing silence. Behind a desk of polished mahogany, a receptionist sat with the rigid posture of a gargoyle. Margaret demanded to see the mayor, her voice raspy and sharp. But the woman didn't even look up. She simply tapped a pen against her desk, stating that the mayor's schedule was finalized through the next quarter. When Margaret mentioned the renovation zone, the receptionist's tone turned to ice. She informed Margaret that Mayor Gates had issued a specific directive. No private audiences for residents affected by the New Asheville initiative. The wall was up, and it was thicker than the bricks of her shop. Frustration boiled over. Margaret bypassed the desk, her footsteps thundering toward the heavy oak doors of the executive suite. Her hand was inches from the brass handle when two shadows fell over her. Security guards, massive and silent in their black uniforms, stepped into her path. She tried to dodge around them, shouting Robert's name, but their hands were like iron clamps on her elbows. They lifted her off her feet, her toes dragging across the marble as they hauled her toward the exit. The heavy front doors swung open, and she was thrust out into the biting cold. She tumbled onto the icy steps, the impact jarring her spine. Behind her, the doors closed with a heavy, final thud that sounded like a coffin lid. Margaret pushed herself up, brushing the slush from her sweater. She looked up at the second floor, where the mayor's office overlooked the square. There, silhouetted against the warm interior light, stood Robert. He held a crystal tumbler, his posture regal and distant. For a heartbeat, she thought he might see her, might see the woman who once bandaged his knee when they were children. But his gaze remained fixed on the horizon, staring through her as if she were a ghost. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for the heavy velvet curtain. He pulled it shut, a red wall of fabric extinguishing the light and leaving her in the growing shadows of the street. The walk back to the shop was a gauntlet of orange plastic and steel. Workers in neon vests were already unloading rolls of chain-link fencing. Large signs with the city's seal were being staked into the frozen earth. Danger zone. No trespassing. A yellow bulldozer sat idling at the very edge of her property, its exhaust puffing like the breath of a dragon. As she reached her door, a man in a hard hat stepped forward, looping a heavy steel chain through the handles. He snapped a padlock shut with a definitive clack. Margaret's world was being caged. The smell of diesel and fresh paint hung heavy in the air, a funeral shroud for the pages of the past. Desperate for a witness, Margaret turned toward the sheriff's office. The bell above his door was cracked, giving a dull, metallic thud as she entered. Sheriff Miller was a man made of leather and indifference. He didn't look up from his desk as she slammed the blue folder down, the papers scattering across his reports. She pointed to the forged signatures, the fraudulent dates. But Miller merely shifted a toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. He didn't even touch the documents. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes small and gray like river stones. He told her, in a voice that was almost a whisper, that Asheville was changing, and that people who stood in the way of change often found themselves victims of unfortunate accidents. It wasn't a warning, it was a threat. The sweetness of the local bakery usually offered a reprieve. But as Margaret stepped inside, the air felt cloying. Tom, a man who had known her since they were in diapers, suddenly found the glass display case fascinatingly dirty. He scrubbed at a non-existent spot, his back turned to her. When she spoke his name, he flinched. She held out a petition, her voice trembling as she spoke of their shared history, of the town they loved. Tom's hands shook as he rearranged a tray of croissants. He mumbled about a new contract for the festival, about the mayor's promise of tax breaks. He wouldn't look her in the eye. He was a man who had sold his silence for a steady supply of flour and sugar, and the shame of it filled the room like smoke. Seeking sanctuary, she fled to the old stone church. The organ was playing a low, mournful dirge as she walked down the center aisle. Father Patrick stood at the altar, his golden vestments gleaming under the light of new, expensive stained glass windows. When Margaret cried out for justice, for the protection of the weak against the greedy, the priest didn't offer a blessing. He looked at her with a pity that felt like a slap. He spoke of the blessings of progress and the generosity of our benefactor, Mayor Gates. He asked the congregation to pray for Margaret's troubled spirit. As she looked around, she saw her neighbors, the people she had lived beside for decades, bow their heads in a synchronized, cowardly silence, The church, like the bakery and the law, had been bought. The night brought no peace. Margaret lay awake in the small apartment above the shop, listening to the wind howl through the cracked window downstairs. A sudden, violent crash of glass made her heart leap. She raced down the stairs, the air in the shop now freezing. On the floor, amidst the shards of her window, lay a brick wrapped in rusted barbed wire. She pushed open the door and gasped. The white trim of her shop was dripping with thick, viscous red paint. It looked like blood, wet and gleaming under the street lights. The smell of turpentine and iron was nauseating. She touched the wall, and the paint clung to her skin, a bright, indelible stain. It was a message written in the language of violence. Leave or bleed. The next morning, she sought legal counsel in a neighboring town, carrying her meager savings in an envelope. The lawyer, a man with tired eyes and a fraying collar, seemed interested until his phone buzzed. He took the call in the corner, his face turning the color of ash. When he returned, he pushed her money back across the desk. He spoke of conflicts of interest and unforeseen complications. Margaret realized then that Robert's reach wasn't limited by the city limits. He had built a cage not just of steel, but of influence and fear. She was being erased, one connection at a time, until there was nothing left but a woman and her books. She walked through the central square where the Founders' Festival was in full swing. A giant billboard had been erected overnight, showing a digital rendering of the Gates Plaza. It was a gleaming monstrosity of glass and chrome, a temple to consumerism that occupied the exact space where her memories lived. Families walked by, laughing and eating popcorn, pointing at the modern amenities promised by the mayor. Margaret stood in the shadow of an old oak, feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. The town was celebrating its own destruction, cheering for the concrete that would bury its heart. The music stopped, and a roar of applause went up as Robert Gates took the stage. He looked perfect, the quintessential leader. He spoke of pruning the dead wood to allow the city to grow. Margaret couldn't stay silent. She pushed through the crowd, holding the blue folder high. She screamed the truth, her voice cracking with the effort to be heard over the loudspeakers. Robert didn't even pause. He simply signaled the sound engineer, and the festive music swelled, a wall of brass and drums that drowned her out. He looked at her then, just for a second, and the cold triumph in his eyes was more terrifying than any bulldozer. The crowd turned on her. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a slow gathering storm of resentment. A man she had once lent a book on gardening pushed her shoulder, telling her to stop being so selfish. Mrs. Green, who had been a regular for 20 years, looked at her with a sneer, complaining that Margaret's eyesore of a shop was holding back the town's property values. The air was thick with their hostility. Margaret was pushed and jostled, her petition trampled under muddy boots. She realized then that the town didn't want the truth. They wanted the shiny new thing Robert had promised them, and they were willing to tear her apart to get it. She ran back to the shop, but the transformation was nearly complete. Workers were bolting the final sections of a 10-foot steel fence into the pavement. Margaret tried to duck under a gap, but a massive hand grabbed her waist. The worker smelled of grease and cold sweat as he threw her back onto the asphalt. The last gate swung shut with a heavy, metallic clang. She gripped the wire mesh, her fingers turning white, staring at her own front door. It was only 20 feet away, but it might as well have been on the moon. She was locked out of her own life. The final blow came at the bank. The ATM screen glowed with a mocking red. Account blocked. She tried her card again, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the machine swallowed it whole. A notification on her phone informed her of a tax discrepancy from a decade ago. a sum that conveniently wiped out every cent she owned. Robert was thorough. He wasn't just taking her building, he was starving her out. She struck the cold plastic of the machine, but it remained silent, a mute witness to her ruin. She returned to the pages of the past, in the gathering gloom. The shop's sign, the one James had carved himself, lay in the mud. A heavy boot print had crushed the gilded P. Margaret picked it up, cradling the splintered wood. The electricity was the next to go. She was sitting in the dark of her apartment when the hum of the refrigerator died. The silence was absolute. She turned the faucet, but only a dry, rattling hiss emerged. No light, no water, no money. She was a prisoner in a cold, dark castle, waiting for the walls to fall. A rhythmic thudding at the door downstairs jolted her upright. Through the window, she saw the silhouette of a man in a heavy coat, a judicial officer. He held a paper with a red seal against the glass, his voice muffled but clear. Emergency evacuation order. Structure deemed imminent hazard. Behind him, the police stood like statues. Margaret didn't answer. She retreated into the shadows of the shop. If they wanted her out, they would have to dig her out. She began to move. With a strength born of pure, unadulterated desperation, she put her shoulder against a massive oak bookcase. It groaned, the wood protesting as she shoved it toward the front door. Volumes of Dickens and Hugo spilled out, but she kept pushing until the door was braced. She moved another, then another, creating a wall of paper and ink. Her hands were raw, bleeding from splinters, but she didn't stop until the entrance was a fortress of classics. She was barricaded inside, surrounded by the only friends she had left. The ground began to shake again. This time it wasn't just a vibration. It was a rhythmic, bone-deep shudder. The bulldozer was moving. Margaret watched from a gap in her book wall as the steel blade approached. The first impact made the entire building groan. Plaster rained down from the ceiling, dusting her hair like snow. The scent of ancient dust filled the air, thick and choking. She gripped the edge of the counter as the floor tilted. The machine was eating the foundation, bit by bit. She retreated to the back, her flashlight cutting a narrow path through the haze. She needed to know why. Why the school? Why the park? She dug back into the blue folder, her eyes scanning the fine print of Object Alpha. It wasn't just a parking garage. The garage was a cover for a massive underground complex. A casino. Robert was turning their mountain town into a gambling hub for the wealthy. And the school, the blueprints showed the school's playground being replaced by a private helipad. The cynicism of it was staggering. He was destroying the future to fund the vices of the present. In the very bottom of the box, her hand brushed something cold. A silver frame, the glass cracked. It was a photo of her and Robert as children, standing in front of the school. On the back, in the elegant script of the town's founder, was a deed of gift. To the children of Asheville, in perpetuity. It was a legal ironclad. The land couldn't be used for commercial purposes. It was a covenant Robert was breaking, a crime that went beyond simple corruption. Margaret held the photo to her chest, the sharp edge of the cracked glass cutting into her palm. She had the one thing Robert couldn't buy: the truth. A deafening roar erupted as the front of the shop gave way. The bookcase wall held for a moment, then collapsed under the weight of the falling roof. Margaret scrambled up a ladder to the small attic window. Below her, the shop was a chaotic swirl of dust and splintering wood. She saw the excavator's claw reach in, dragging out a section of the floor. She had seconds. She kicked out the window frame, the glass shattering against the bricks below. She didn't think. She just jumped. She landed in a heap of discarded insulation and wet trash, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She lay still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. A guard's flashlight swept over the debris, missing her by inches. She crawled through the mud, her fingers clawing at the frozen earth, until she found a gap in the fence. She squeezed through, the jagged wire tearing her coat, and vanished into the shadows of the alley. Behind her, the pages of the past gave a final, agonizing groan and collapsed into a pile of rubble. Margaret ran. She didn't go to the police, and she didn't go to the church. She ran toward the town hall. The Founders' Gala was reaching its crescendo. She saw Sheriff Miller at the door, his hand on his belt, looking for her. She didn't try the front. She knew the service entrance, the one the caterers used. She slipped inside, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her face smeared with blood and soot. She was a nightmare in a room full of dreams. She burst into the main ballroom just as Robert was raising his glass for the final toast. The doors slammed against the walls, the sound like a gunshot. The music stopped. The elite of Asheville turned, their faces a mask of shock. Margaret didn't stop. She marched down the center aisle, the blue folder held high. She reached the stage before the guards could react, her hand slamming onto the microphone. "Look at him!" she screamed, her voice amplified until it shook the chandeliers. "Look at the man who sold your children's school for a casino." She didn't give them a chance to look away. She activated the overhead projector, throwing the secret blueprints onto the massive screen behind Robert. The images of the casino, the helipad, and the forged signatures filled the room. Then, she held up the founder's deed. The words, "in perpetuity," glowed like a holy fire. "He didn't just take my shop," she cried, her voice breaking. "He took our history. He took our law. He took our soul." Robert tried to grab the folder, his face a mask of primal fury, but she dodged him. She began to read the names, the bribes, the payoffs, the secret debts. She saw the baker flinch. She saw the priest turn away. She laid the town's shame bare in front of the cameras. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating thing. Then the sound began. It started in the back, a low, angry murmur that grew into a roar. The people of Asheville, the ones who had turned their backs, were looking at the screen, then at Robert. The betrayal was too big to ignore. The representative of the development firm stood up, his face pale. He announced into the sudden quiet that his company would not be a party to fraud. The project was dead. The room exploded. People surged toward the stage, their voices a cacophony of rage. Sheriff Miller tried to reach Margaret, but the crowd blocked him. For the first time, they weren't protecting the law. They were protecting her. A state prosecutor, who had been an invited guest, stepped forward, his face grim. He took the blue folder from Margaret's shaking hands. "I think we have enough here, Margaret," he said softly. Margaret walked out of the town hall and into the cold night air. The reporters swarmed her, their flashes blinding, but she didn't see them. She saw the neighbors who were now trying to catch her eye, their faces full of a desperate, late-coming guilt. She didn't stop to talk. She walked back to the corner where her shop had stood. The heavy machinery was gone, leaving only deep, muddy scars in the earth. A pile of rubble was all that remained of her life. She stepped onto the debris, her boots sinking into the wet plaster. There, half buried under a broken beam, was her sign. She pulled it free, wiping the gray dust from the word past. She sat on a pile of bricks, the splintered wood in her lap. The shop was gone. The town was saved. but it was broken in a way that no deed could fix. She looked at the people gathering at the edge of the site, watching her in a silence that felt like a funeral. She had won. But as she sat among the ruins of her world, Margaret Hensley had never felt more alone. She closed her eyes, the scent of old paper and dust still clinging to her skin, and for the first time in 10 years, she let herself cry.